In the last episode, we looked at Beowulf from one particular topos, which was the poet topos, right? A common image where writers of the period include poets as part of the narrative. And it is a pattern to be expected in older literature. Now, where we stopped was about the enigma of the monsters. And when do the monsters appear? The monsters appear at the building of Hrothgar's hall. So let's begin with the hall. The hall, as you know, is the product of war. The fortunes of war favored Hrothgar. Friends and kinsmen flocked to his ranks, young followers, a force that grew to be a mighty army. So his mind turned to hall building. He handed down orders for men to work on a great mead hall meant to be a wonder of the world forever. It would be his throne room, and there he would dispense his God-given goods to young and old. But not the common land or people's lives. Far and wide through the world I have heard orders for work to adorn that wall-stead were sent to many peoples, and soon it stood there, finished and ready in full view, the Hall of Halls. Herod was the name. He had settled on it, whose utterance was law, nor did he renege, but doled out rings and torques at the table. That's his generosity. Hrothgar, the Danish king, has won battles, gained retainers, like he's built a Hollywood entourage, and now is ready to establish his governance. And it's represented here by his public architecture. Public architecture reflects power. Now, notice how his new hall is represented in a way like God's own creation. He turns his mind, or it came into his mind, the idea to build a world or city or a hall, the greatest hall. And your translator gives it a biblical turn of phrase. He calls it the Hall of Halls. Unfortunately, like God's creations, God creates man, and as we'll see this in the Noah and Mrs. Noah plays of the later Middle Ages, the Middle English period, the creation is very unpredictable because of the nature of man. And the Old Testament is filled with God trying to resolve a design flaw that man, after the fall of Eden, cannot be controlled. So even here, just like God's creation, with the hall, bad things are on the horizon. The hall towered, its gables wide and high and awaiting a barbarous burning. That doom abided, but in time it would come. The killer instinct unleashed among in-laws, the bloodlust rampant. This splendid hall awaits the fires that will turn it into a ruin. Notice that Old English topos we discussed the last time when we talked about the elegies, the ruins topos, right? We saw it in The Wanderer, and we saw it as well in The Ruin. However, it's not Time the Destroyer that will turn this public architecture, this hall, into ruins, but it will be his own family. Now, telling us the future, this is not prophecy, okay? This is the Latin figure of prolepsis. And it relates to an old story. This is one of those tales within the tales that's being retold. It's a textual reference of what is to be anticipated, what is going to happen in a tale. That's what prolepsis is. I guess you could call it foreshadowing. I think of it as anticipation. It's a figure of anticipation. The figure is telling us what will happen. In other words, what do we know is going to happen? We know that the hall will be destroyed. Now here is where the text is situated within a larger nexus of text, right? Within a larger textual tradition. And what I mean by that is it's placed within a larger storytelling. In another Old English poem, Widsith, Hrothgar is attacked by his in-laws. Now this is an attack we're going to discuss later. What's important is Hrothgar's confidence or blindness in regards to the effects of his war. I came to believe my enemies had faded from the face of the earth. Let's focus on the first appearance of monsters before they are understood as human. After he foreshadows future killers, familial killers, the in-laws, the author brings in Grendel and a poet singer. Then a powerful demon, a prowler through the dark, nursed a hard grievance. It harrowed him to hear the din of the loud banquet every day in the hall, the harp being struck and the clear song of a skilled poet telling with mastery of man's beginnings, how the Almighty had made the earth a gleaming plain girdled with waters. Doesn't this remind you of Cataman? The song is annoying to the monster, to Grendel. In his splendor he set the sun and moon to be earth's lamplight, lanterns for men, and filled the broad lap of the world with branches and leaves, and quickened life in every other thing that moved. You get here the shope, that's the Old English word for the poet, the shaper of words, and you get Cataman's hymn, right? That Neoplatonic topos of God the Creator, the creator of the hall and creation itself, and they're coming together. The biblical explanation is clear. The monster's origins are found after the creation. Grendel was the name of this grim demon, haunting the marshes and marauding round the heath and the desolate fens. He had dwelt for a time in misery among the banished monsters, Cain's clan, whom the Creator had outlawed and condemned as outcasts. For the killing of Abel, the eternal Lord had exacted a price. Right, that's the blood feud. Cain got no good from committing that murder because the Almighty made him anathema, and out of the curse of his exile there sprung ogres and elves and evil phantoms, and the giants too, who strove with God time and again until he gave them their reward. What a list of monsters. In the Old English, you even hear the Orkneas, or underwater corpses, or sea monsters. The text is filled with monsters. However, it occurred my sword had killed 9 sea monsters. They had seen me boltered in the blood of enemies when I battled and bound 5 beasts, raided a troll nest, and in the night sea slaughtered sea brutes. Notice as well the hilt of the old sword. It was engraved all over and showed how war first came into the world and the flood destroyed the tribe of giants. They suffered a terrible severance from the Lord, and any description of images is called ekphrasis. Ekphrasis, the monsters are engraved as images on the sword. Notice also when Beowulf, the older Beowulf, is heading towards the dragon lair. The water was infested with all kinds of reptiles. There were wreathing sea dragons and monsters slouching on slopes by the cliff, serpents and wild things such as those that often surface at dawn to roam the sail road. And sail road is what we call in Old English a kenning, and a kenning is a kind of compound word that creates, it's like a metonymy, I guess. It creates an image. Like whale road. A sail road, of course, is the ocean. And finally notice there's no real image of Grendel the monster. Unlike the comics and the movie versions of Beowulf, and I hope you have not just watched a movie or read a comic and not read the book. the comics and the movies fail because Grendel, the monster, cannot be represented, nor can his mother. We only get glimpses of his physical self. I have heard it said by my people in Hall, counselors who live in the upland country, that they have seen two such creatures prowling the moors, huge marauders from some other world. One of these things, as far as anyone ever can discern, looks like a woman. The other, warped in the shape of a man, moves beyond the pale, bigger than any man, an unnatural birth called Grendel by the country people in former days. They are fatherless creatures, and their whole ancestry is hidden in a past of demons and ghosts. They dwell apart among wolves on the hills, on wind-swept crags, treacherous caches, where cold streams pour down the mountains and disappear under mists and moorlands. That means they're beyond genealogy, right? They're fatherless. Ultimately, the filmmaker and the comic book illustrator have to supply an image, and the image is always inadequate to your own imaginative representations. When you are reading Beowulf, your image of Grendel and Grendel's mother, how do you represent that? Whatever it is in your mind is that monster. Now, as for the Orkneyas, that naturally reminds you of J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was the first to defend Beowulf on the grounds that it was a great work of literature, not the repository of some sort of historical knowledge about the period. That's a feature of Beowulf, and we talked about that. The stories about the Finns and the Danes and the Geats and those other tales, the stories within stories. He was particularly drawn to its monsters. You can see how fantasy literature springs from Beowulf. Medieval literature, when you read a lot of it, does not have monsters, as many monsters as you think. For every dragon or so that occurs in Merlin, there are pages and pages and pages without any fantastical elements. So Tolkien tells us that we should look at this poem in a serious manner. And I notice as well how serious this poem is in the way the poet, and the poet is always identifying himself. Did you notice that in the first person? He's always interjecting about what he's heard. He creates parallels between the Hall and creation and between Grendel and Cain. What you're noticing is a Christian overlay onto the pagan material. But those comments do not help explain why Grendel appears at that moment. The connection is still obscure. The poet is expecting us to solve a riddle. He's asking us to think hard. Why is Grendel, for example, waging his lonely war? In the next episode, we're going to look at those monsters and how they reflect on our own worst instincts.
Alright guys, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell.